Welcome to All About Campion, an introduction to loving the films of Jane Campion. I'm Inkoo Kang, a critic at the Washington Post, and I'm joined today, as I would be in India or the Australian outback, by my co-host, Daniel Schroeder, a podcast producer at Slate.
Hey, Inkoo.
We are also joined this episode by a very special guest, Lovia, Gyarkye, a critic at The Hollywood Reporter. Hi, Lovia.
Hi. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
This is going to be a lot of fun.
In this episode, we are going to talk about Holy Smoke, the 1999 comedy romance that's definitely not a romantic comedy, starring Kate Winslet and Harvey Keitel. For all the Campion completists out there, we did not forget about Portrait of a Lady. We will be returning to it in a later episode. In Holy Smoke, Winslet plays Ruth, a young Australian woman in need of spiritual fulfillment who travels to India and finds a guru she intends to marry. Her family gets her back to Australia and forces her into cult deprogramming, administered by Keitel's exit counselor PJ, who soon finds himself in over his head. One source of inspiration for the film was a friend of Campion's who joined the Moonies and apparently struggled valiantly to get the filmmaker to join the cult too.
Love that.
To put Holy Smoke into some context, the film came out 6 years after The Piano and 2 years after Titanic and Jackie Brown, which we mentioned because Pam Grier has a small role here. Unlike in some previous episodes, we will not be running through a list of all the accolades it received, since it received very few, if any.
Boo.
Boo. Definitely.
Along with Portrait of a Lady and In the Cut, the subject of our next episode, Holy Smoke is considered one of Campion's weakest movies. But Daniel and I will probably argue, and I think Lovia will agree, that it deserves a much better reputation than it has. Before we get started, Daniel, what happens in Holy Smoke?
The film opens on Ruth, played by Kate Winslet, and her friend visiting India, looking for a real-life guru. Her friend, having returned from India without her, recounts to Ruth's parents what happened that led Ruth to stay in the country. Ruth's parents decide she has been brainwashed into a cult and so scheme to lure her back home in order to deprogram her. Ruth's mother, played by Julie Hamilton, travels to India to retrieve her daughter using a concocted story about her husband, Ruth's father, being sick, but ends up having her own medical emergency while visiting and must be flown home accompanied by Ruth. When Ruth arrives home, she's taken to a remote house with cult deprogrammer PJ Waters, played by Harvey Keitel, so he can spend the next 3 days bringing her back. But it seems he may have met his match as Ruth defies his attempts and even ends up flipping the dynamic as she sleeps with him and he grows increasingly obsessed with her until he knocks her out and throws her in the trunk of his car. Thankfully, her family has driven out to check on her and save her from the car trunk and drive home with PJ broken in the trunk bed until Ruth joins him there and comforts him on the drive home. A year later, Ruth is back in India with her mother. PJ has moved on to settle down with his girlfriend Carol, played by Pam Grier, and he and Ruth exchange letters where they still look back fondly on the common bond they forged during their time together.
Let's start with Lovia, since she's our guest today. What did you think of this movie?
Oh my gosh. I was so surprised that it got terrible reviews. Truly, that it was some of the worst film that some people had seen, which was shocking because I really, really liked it. I felt I told you this over the phone a couple weeks ago, Inkoo, that I'm a newly converted Jane Campion stan. Which may or may not be the reason why I'm here today. But I just really admire her as a filmmaker, and I felt like this film in particular really confirmed that for me. I didn't know where it was going the entire time. Well, at the beginning, I thought I knew where it was going. I was like, oh, this is going to be funny. This is going to be, about Ruth coming into her own. Maybe I might be offended if this stays in India, but whatever. The potential to be bad is high. But I just felt like at every single turn, I was completely surprised and I was taken aback. And I'm so excited to talk about all the twists because there's just so much here. It's like a really sprawling film and really packed thematically. And also I think just visually impressive as well. So
yeah, all of the scenes out like in the Australian desert with like those really like orangier than orange sunsets and like I mean, he knows how to paint a picture.
I loved the mixture of the wide landscapes and the very small human pieces in that landscape.
Definitely.
And I think watching the movie from 2021, something that really struck me, especially in contrast to these like grand vistas, is like how almost excruciatingly 90s like all of the fashion was. And like, you know, the soundtrack is full of like Alanis and just like is like a complete Madeline in a bunch of ways for like the late 90s. And for whatever reason, like I just love that contrast with almost a sort of like teeny boppiness of a certain era combined with all of the like timeless landscapes of the movie.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Inkoo. I feel like that Campion did a good job of mixing and matching, and that's part of the reason why I loved Sophie Lee's character. She plays Ruth's sister, who is...
Isn't it sister-in-law?
Sister-in-law. Oh, you're right, because she's married to her brother.
She plays
right?
Yvonne. That's the character.
Yvonne, yeah. I just loved her, and I felt like she was sort of this stand-in for, like, she's truly, like, the most, I felt like the most 90s character, just from her hair, like, that god-awful coloring job, but that really worked for her, all of her outfits. The first thing that I noticed was when she, like, the first time she's on screen, she's wearing that, like, cross, which has made a comeback. I don't know if you guys saw, but Madonna is recently wearing an enlarged version of that cross on the cover of Rolling Stone. Because, you know, we're back in the 90s, but I, like, immediately noticed that, and I was like, oh, my God, this is, like, the fashion. I'm already, like, the costume design is incredible, and I love that she's kind of, like, in this in-between state of being this, like, weird, like, girlhood. Like, she's fully a mother, you know, and an adult, but also dresses like she is 17 years old, and I was obsessed with her character.
I loved her blonde, like, front, like, streaks. Those were just perfect. She is one of the best characters in the movie, for sure.
They were extremely ginger spice.
Yes.
Yes.
And I have, like, actually a really fun quote from Campion, which is, like, her sort of, like, thinking about the two main female characters, Ruth and Yvonne, where she says, "At first I thought it was Ruth, the younger woman, and I still do. Real love seems psychotic most of the time. I haven't been very successful at it myself. I feel myself as Yvonne, too. The complete ditz who gets manipulated all the time. Falls in love is just a romantic idiot who fantasizes about sex and love all day long. And honestly, who doesn't love, like, a filmmaker who can read themselves?"
Truly.
Wait, I love that quote. I mean, aren't we all a little bit Yvonne? I think even though she was so ridiculous, like, I felt like she was a stand-in for me as the audience, you know? Like, she's just, like, not really quite sure what's going on. She's kind of vibes. I also thought Harvey was really attractive in this film. Like, I would have easily
go watch
been
the
seduced.
piano.
I was like, wait a minute. I was surprised at the feelings that I had. I was like, what are these feelings that are bubbling up so sudden, so new? You know, but
I felt the moment. Sorry.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes.
I saw you. I saw where you're going. I got you. I love Yvonne too, and I think what's great about her is that, like, it seemed at least clear to me that she is the type of woman that he was expecting to deprogram. And he's clearly so good at manipulating those types of women, and that's like just probably his bread and butter. So he didn't even know what to do with Kate Winslet when he got her.
Definitely.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Another thing I want to mention about the 90s-ness, which this happens towards the end, even though, like, Pam Grier isn't in the film as much as I would have wished, when she, like, gets to Australia and she's wearing that green ensemble and, like, the camera zooms in on her nails that are also a matching green. I was like, there's nothing more 90s than this than this whole fit. You know what I mean? Like,
and the cheetah print scarf.
Yes, like, it was just incredible. And like that, I just loved the way the camera just like rested on her figure and like took note of her nails and just like those small details that I feel like were really actually a big part of this film. And I thought like the film did really well is just noticing these like sort of like really tiny details about everyone or about the scenes or the landscape and making us pay attention to them.
I will say if that neon chartreuse that Pam Grier was wearing comes back, I will throw a fit.
What? Like in a why? What?
I mean, I would love to wear that color, so get
Me
out.
too. You're outnumbered right now. Explain yourself.
How dare you?
I feel like that neon chartreuse has plenty, so I don't need to explain myself.
Yeah.
It sounds like you guys like really fell for this romance.
I don't know if I fell for the romance exactly. I felt, especially the whole time that like Harvey was seducing or Kate Winslet was seducing the other one, like each other. I didn't really love that because I was a bit like unnerved and creeped out by it because like he's so much older than her. Not that that's a problem, but just like he seemed lecherous in a way that I didn't care for, but it still like it made me love the movie. Even in like I wasn't falling for Harvey like I was in The Piano, but I was like falling for their dynamic.
Just to like stay with The Piano a little bit longer, I think something I really noticed watching Holy Smoke is sort of like this kind of like almost take on Beauty and the Beast. Like The Piano, like the central romance in The Piano, there's sort of like this like coercive caging element to it, right? And so much of The Piano is about like this woman who, despite that caging and the coercion, like figures out a way to like assert her independence and her equality to the guy who is basically her warden. And you have basically like that exact same dynamic here where she's forced to give up her shoes so that she can't leave the shack in the middle of nowhere where she's supposed to be deprogrammed.
It's also sort of Taming of the Shrewy.
Yes, it's very true. And so I was a little bit like, this is interesting that this is like the romantic scenario that like you return to, like especially in such a short period of time. But you know, I don't know, it really worked for me.
I mean, I could see Jane Campion wanting to conquer her men.
No comment. As serious. Daniel, while we were watching the movie together, was making some not so nice comments about Harvey Keitel's physicality.
Not his physicality, but just his skincare regimen.
But like, I don't know. I actually found him like a lot sexier here, just as this like kind of like urban cowboy who is like definitely past his prime. But also, I like men who like put in an effort into their physical appearance. And so even though a lot of the dynamic was like her making fun of like his age and
his hair dye.
I was like, at least he's trying.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated his effort. You know what's interesting? Like, I still haven't figured out if their dynamic worked for me because the scenes that they had together, like, I found really enthralling. Like, I was super engaged and I was kind of like, this is really hot. You both are doing an absolutely amazing job right now. But it's the character set up, especially for PJ, Harvey Keitel's character, that it kind of like felt a little like discordant. Like he comes in kind of hot, like as this like, you know, cowboy, super confident. He's going to deprogram this girl. You know, he's really like, there's obviously the air of like misogyny and he's, you know, not, he knows his own strength and power. And I think it was hard for me to believe that would all kind of disintegrate in 3 days, you know? But maybe, especially because of, again, the character that Ruth sort of like is introduced as, especially at the beginning in those early scenes where she is in India with her friend. And even the scene where she is back at her parents and she's like dancing in their backyard and she's like, oh, I'll race you to see her father. Like it's very like girlish, maybe like a little naive. And so even though the scenes themselves, like where the power dynamics shifts, like worked for me because I was like, wow, again, both of you are doing an amazing job here. I kind of struggled to buy the transition, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. I think the reason it worked for me is because of how it echoed the initial experience Kate Winslet's character had when Ruth is in India and she and her friend are going to see this guru just as like some voyeuristic touristy thing. And then it turns out that she is touched both physically and like spiritually in a way that she wasn't even expecting, but is all of a sudden changed and changes her life, her name, her entire persona to like become part of this. I don't know if I would call it a cult. We can get into that, but
yeah,
to become part of this religious group.
Yeah.
And so I think that like Harvey Keitel is having that type of experience himself with Ruth. Ruth is his, in some ways, guru, but like neither of them are. She's not doing it intentionally. He's not seeking that sort of thing out, obviously. But like even with especially one of the final images of the film, which is her as that Hindu goddess, it's very clear that like she is his that.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense.
Yeah, and like Kate wants to marry the guru. Harvey Keitel sort of like out of nowhere is like, let me marry you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't actually piece that together until now, but like now that makes so much more sense.
No, I know. I'm like, wait a minute.
Well, that's why I'm here.
You're on to something.
Okay. I think that the other thing I really loved about I definitely agree when Lovia said before that like you didn't exactly know where the movie was going. And I think there is sort of this like messiness to the script a little bit where like you don't have the goalposts of like the relationship and like the transition so clearly telegraphed to the audience. And there was like a part of me that like really appreciated that. And then there was like a part of me that was like really frustrated by it because I was like, I want to know more about like how exactly we're moving from like point A to B to C. But I think like also at the same time, I think one of the things that sort of like bring Kate Winslet around into like understanding where he's coming from is when he finally shares that story about how he also fell under the sway of like his own guru who also tried to sort of like have this sexual relationship with him. And
I mean, it's Harvey Keitel. If I were his guru, I'd try.
Sure. But I think like the thing that like really probably like softened her up is her finally realizing that like he's in this line of work because of his like own particular experiences that he wants to save other people from. Mm-hmm. Is that like a fair project or not? We can have a discussion about that. But I think the other thing is that in the same way she has this like big gaping hole that she is trying to fill, she sees that he also has this like big gaping hole, and they're both wanting to fill it through spirituality, but they're not finding it, so they're filling it through sex. And yeah, you just have this like moment of like two people realizing that they are part of the same pod, even though they would never have guessed that. And I think like that was like a moment for me that I really treasured from the film.
Yeah. I enjoyed all of their moments together because I loved how, like, within the dynamic of this romance, it was developing and there were moments where it felt super heightened, and then they would go into this depression, and then it would be super heightened again. But that scene especially, like, was incredibly moving. When you were talking, Inkoo, about the script and the messiness, like, wanting to know, like, how we got from point A to point B, I actually thought of, now I'm wondering, you know, maybe this is giving too much credit, but now I'm wondering, like, that's kind of mirrors the experience of, like, joining a cult or being overcome. Just thinking back to Daniel's point, like, you don't really know how you get from point, like, that's, you know, the whole point of these, like, or the whole curiosity or fascination with cults is, like, you wonder, like, wait, but then how did you just, like, at what point did you lose yourself that you go from, like, you know, thinking in one way to being completely subsumed by this group, And there's just like a huge unknown, and I think in some ways the script not being clear about that is mirroring the experience of literally, it's just asking you to like believe in the same way almost.
By the way, something really weird that I found out about the script is that this script credited to Jane Campion and her sister Anna, her older sister Anna, who was a filmmaker in her own right. Apparently, Jane Campion wrote like what she called the beginning and the end of the movie. And Anna Campion wrote like the middle parts that relate to the central romance, which I found utterly bizarre. But
whoa. They also turned it into it's also a novel. Did you guys know that? So random.
But I feel like it was part of that whole like thing in the 90s where you, like all movies get novelizations.
Yeah. I was just like, this would be an awful novel, no offense.
I really disagree. I think it's a much better novel than it would be a movie. I think
because of the parts, like the connecting parts.
Yeah, but I think that also something like existential despair or like a spiritual crisis, like that's really hard to like portray on screen, because the usual way that like you would just picture it is like some gorgeous person looking off like into like doing like 1,000-yard stare and just being like sad, and you're like, oh, look at that like beautiful sad person. And it's like really hard to like feel like the depth of that spiritual emptiness. And I think it's probably a lot easier to do in text.
Yeah.
Daniel, we're going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that I don't read books, so I like it the way it is. But what I was going to say was actually like back to the point of this script possibly mirroring the experience of the like being drawn into a cult, not knowing how you ended up there. It's kind of also maybe the experience that we had watching this, in that like we didn't necessarily know we were going to love this, and it seems like everybody says like, oh, it's not that great, and then there's just something about it, some like magic of the movie that made us kind of like fall under its spell. Like, is Holy Smoke our cult leader? Won't go that far, but
absolutely, I'd be into it. Let's think about this.
I think we're also sort of like living currently in this like period of like, we're like in peak cult entertainment.
Cultissance. Right? We're having a cultissance.
Cult.
And I remember like reading the logline or like the Wikipedia summary or whatever, and thinking like, oh, this is like a really great premise for a movie. Like, number one, it's kind of cheap because all you really need for like your main set is like a house, and then you can have like two people bouncing off each other. But also, I don't know, it's such a great opportunity for a character study, and it sort of made me surprised that you don't have a lot more films about cult deprogramming, because I feel like a lot of people would be really interested in that, especially right now, especially after watching something like The Vow or whatever. By the way, no one in The Vow like was deprogrammed in 3 days, and the 3-day thing was like the thing I found the least like believable about this movie. But
yeah, the 3-day thing was a bit of a stretch, but I bought into it. I was like, you know what?
You bought into every part of this, so
I did. I was like, sure. Take me there. Take me there.
I did think it was really interesting, like all of the actual like real life cult stuff that they integrated into the film. I mean, yeah, of course, like I know the story of like Jonestown and of Heaven's Gate and all that, but it felt so much more vivid to me in 2021 because of the like documentaries around those cults that have like cropped up in recent like months and years. Like, and of course, maybe like in the 90s, people would have easily recognized this in a way that I didn't before I saw the Heaven's Gate documentary on HBO. But like, I didn't know who that guy was who was in charge of Heaven's Gate. But like seeing him in this movie, like seeing footage of him in this movie being used was like really affecting, because I knew like what, like I had like an actual understanding of that story as well. And so it made like that whole part where they're watching the like cult films together more real and like relatable.
Yeah, I think that like the other part of this is sort of like the India part of it, where instead of sort of these like out branches of Christianity, you have, I mean, like, I think like truly like my only frame of reference for this is something like Wild Wild Country, which started out as like a cult or like a sect in India, and then sort of like had like a, I don't know, like a colony or something, like in Oregon. But I think that we have sort of been circling around like this issue of like, why is this cult so vague? And like, I think it has so much to do with like how we're supposed to think of Kate Winslet's character, especially at the beginning.
Where she's just trying to like eat, pray, love.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time, like maybe like in the first half of the movie, trying to decide like, does she have a point in wanting to like get away from Australia and wanting to get away from her family and even like marrying this guy, this guru, or like is she like completely full of shit and just like a smug teenager or like an early 20 something who was like, I know better than you, mom, like you're a hypocrite, dad. And I think that there was a sort of like nice tension in that. And maybe you couldn't get as much tension out of that if the cult had sort of been more defined.
Yeah, but I do think that like one point that you just kind of made that I want to like hone in a bit more specifically is that, so like Heaven's Gate and Jonestown and the cults that like we see depicted that aren't this amorphous cult quote unquote from India are like all Christian endeavors, and that like her family, who likely is of the Christian persuasion, though of course like who knows, are so quick to judge the like religiosity of Hinduism, of like Indian culture, because they don't even understand it necessarily. I'm not saying that like this guy who is convincing women to marry him isn't a cult leader or something, but like there's such a, like, it's interesting that the cults that we are shown are like Christian cults, and that really part of the reaction that her family might be having is just pure xenophobia.
Yeah, and she even says that at some point. She's like, oh, mom and dad are mad because I'm with the... because they hate Indians or something. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, especially just the subjective... because especially the videos that they show in this, they show her are all of Christian cults, and then this one, which I'm kind of hesitant to call a cult. I don't know why, but because
we know so little of it.
Yeah, that's probably true. I don't know. At the beginning of the film, I definitely thought she was just full of shit. You know, like 100%.
Like every girl who like went to study abroad and then like tells everyone she knows that like she went to India
to study abroad, right? And it changed her life.
She put on the new Lorde album and was just like, I'm feeling Eastern vibes.
Right. She's changed forever. I definitely didn't believe, I thought that she was just sort of like angsty, but I towards the end, especially after because of her conversations with PJ, I started to sort of believe like, oh, maybe she really is trying to figure something out, and this is just a means to that end, and that something is really trying to like figure herself out, particularly when she's like, I feel like I'm unlovable and it's hard for people to get close to me, just to back to your point, Inkoo, about her trying to fill this gap, and I think those conversations made her character's motivations more convincing to me.
Yeah, and this actually reminded me of, as we're talking about it, this reminds me a lot of my like background, because I'm from the South. I grew up the son of a minister, and I worked at a like church camp in college, and I just remember so clearly all of the people who made religion their personality, and like they were so desperate to find something to define them that, oh, well, if I just allow this religion to subsume me, then that is who I am. And my identity can be that, so I don't have to look at me. And what Kate Winslet is, it seems, doing is a sort of thing like that, where she has fled her family, but is finding another place to just escape from self. And that her experience with Harvey Keitel isn't her necessarily getting deprogrammed from a cult, but kind of like waking up to having to like take charge of herself.
I think I had like a really similar like line of thought, but like framed it kind of differently, which is that basically she seems like someone who has been trying to rebel all her life. I think there's like a really quick passing comment early on where she's walking around like in these saris while she's back at home with her family in Australia. And someone is like, wanted to wear like normal clothes. And then someone else is like, it's not like she would look like a girl anyway, like even in her normal clothes. And so you definitely get the sense that this is just like a girl who is like really good at rebelling and always knows how to push other people's buttons.
Like when she yells at her mother, something like, but why are you here? Why are you here on this earth? Such a petulant child thing to do.
And then I think, yeah, like when she is forced to like spend all of this time pushing Harvey Keitel's buttons and like basically like rebelling against him so hard that she somehow like pushes him into submission, she has to sort of like figure out like what exactly is she rebelling against. And then I think she gets to like a point where she's like, oh, I don't like have like a real thing that like I'm rebelling against. And I think she has to like confront that emptiness inside her again. And I found all of that like really beautiful and meaningful. So I think that one of the things that we can probably agree is one of the most memorable scenes of the movie is the pee scene, where Ruth has like burned all of her clothes. And then she decides that she is going to like walk around naked. And then she approaches PJ and then just like pees on herself. And I will
PJ's on herself.
I hate you.
Sorry.
And I think like one of like I read somewhere that apparently Kate Winslet really wanted to just like literally pee on herself, but it didn't look like cinematic enough. And so she had to like wear like a tube of like saline like on her butt crack in order to like make the fluid like gush out faster so it looked like really dynamic.
Oh my God.
What did you guys make of the pee scene and like the fact that she peed on herself like in front of this guy?
I think at that point in the film, I was just like, literally anything can happen in this film, and I'm just gonna be like, wow, can't believe that happened, you know? And so I wasn't even fazed, I don't think, by it as much as I should have been. You know, like now that you're recounting it, I'm like, no, that was weird. That was just like a bizarre thing to have happened and to have taken place. But I think it really speaks to just how many bizarre things happen in the film and how much like Campion throws at you or threw at me that I was just like, oh, no, naturally, it's time to pee right here and now.
I was definitely, honestly, the most startled by like the immediate full nudity. I was like, oh, okay, that's where we are. But yeah. I felt like the peeing in some ways was maybe like her not attempt to like scare Harvey Keitel away, but like to kind of play the game against him in a way.
I mean, it's weird. I mean, it was interesting to me that right after that, he was like, this is what is going to turn me. And I was like, really? This is what convinces you that, I guess, of her, like, just the full desperation. It seemed like the final desperate act she could do in this, like, attempt to shift the power dynamics by infantilizing herself, you know?
I mean, I think that there's definitely this infantilizing mode that, like, you can read the peace scene in. And I did read this, like, really, I don't know, this, like, really, like, annoying but probably correct analysis of the movie which is that she just has like a very, very terrible daddy issues.
Oh my god.
And like how the guru goes by Baba, which means father. And how like she ends up with Harvey Keitel's character because he's like a much older man. And like the P is just like a scene of like her, I don't know, like regression or whatever. I feel like a lot of like that really like tracks and it's really coherent, but also it like streamlines the movie for me in a way that like I don't particularly enjoy. I will note that like before she pees on herself, like she says to him like nobody likes me, and sort of has this like moment of like utter of like really like laying down like the walls that she had put up in the front of him. And then of course like after that is like a scene where like they fuck. And really, like, I personally would not trust an outdoor shower to get rid of all of the pee, but whatever. They seem like they're doing their own thing in their little island too, so whatever.
Hey, urine is sterile, Inkoo.
Yeah.
Urine also has a smell, Daniel.
I get it, but hey, as a gay man, I have to be open to a lot of things.
I'm screaming.
Sorry, we won't get into the water sports.
This is the perfect movie for this podcast.
It truly is. Honestly, this was, I think, my favorite movie we've watched of hers. I had fun in this in a way that I didn't have in the piano, even though I love the piano. It was engaging in a way that I found Sweetie boring. It was just like, it had a life to it. And it wasn't some period drama. It was, I mean, granted, yeah, it was a period. It was the 90s, but like it was a contemporary film of the time. And so for all that it does, for all that, like what we have said about like Campion making it so 90s actually does kind of in retrospect make it a period film, but like a contemporary period film where it's like she's using the what I would imagine are the techniques and mechanics you would use if you were making a period film about a different time, and deploys them about her own time, like the own time that like the actual modern time. And so it does keep it grounded in this like 1990s-ness even now. Like we felt that so viscerally, even though like so much of it isn't necessarily attached to a time period. Like I think that a lot of what happens in the Outback where Kate Winslet and Harvey Keitel are is like a timeless experience, a timeless moment that like could fit in a variety of time periods, but like there is so much work done and so much smart work done, not like work that you see the work, but like so much smart work done to really keep us in the moment of the movie. And so like I also
want to say like this is like a very rare comedy that she has made. And like we can like quibble a little bit about like how much of it is a comedy. But one thing I really appreciate about Jane Campion is that when she puts like a joke or like a weird gag into a movie, it's never like the kind of like joke that you would expect from most writers and directors. Like there's like a later scene where Kate Winslet decides she wants to like run away from the shack because she's tired of being around Harvey Keitel, but he's taken her shoes. And so she just like wraps a bunch of books to her feet. There's also like this like other completely random scene where it looks like something out of like Fury Road, where there are these like two cars like on the road in Australia. This is like with like the gay brother and his like friends, and like one of the like kids just like walks like on the roof of a speeding car to the roof of like the speeding car right next to it.
So stressful.
And like it's like a weirdly funny scene, and I think that she just like has like a very like bizarre sense of humor that I always appreciate in her movies, because you get like weird visual gags that you would not get from anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I loved when one of the scenes that I actually laughed out loud, aka I cackled at, was when Kate Winslet's character is like, I've had relationships, and it goes into that like montage of her high school sweethearts. and they're all like winking at the camera. I literally was like, that's hilarious. Like I loved that part, and just that kind of humor. And also, I mean, I not take this back to Yvonne, the sister, but she's just such a funny character and like had some of the best lines. Her, in addition to the gay brother. Like when they come into the house and they start kneeling. This is at the beginning when I thought this was going to be a comedy, and then it took a different turn. But like that whole, like the entire first part of the film, with the family, like is very funny. Like it feels like a sitcom almost.
Yeah, they're very comic relief, and that's actually a moment where Inkoo laughed out loud, which is when Yvonne let her child jump straight and fall flat on the ground. Do you remember that?
That's the thing where whenever I see a child like fall on the ground, it just like makes me laugh really loudly. And
wow, should we unpack that?
No. This isn't all about Inkoo. I think there was also just this like weird sight, like completely unremarked upon gag where a sheep is in the living room and they're using like the top of the sheep as like a coffee table. It's just like makes no sense unless maybe you live in 1999 Australia.
Yeah, but you also get like when Yvonne is driving the car and the kangaroos jump out and she's like, oh,
yes.
Like, there are so many good gags like that are just like the family is the cartoon.
Yes.
Yeah. Wait, oh my God. We talked about the pee scene, but we didn't talk about the blowjob scene, which I kind of laughed at, which maybe was not okay. I know. Well, just the part where he's like
really funny because Yvonne is giving like Harvey Keitel a blowjob, and then doesn't he say something like just keep
breathe because she's like having like because at first it seems like she's kind of having like an anxiety attack being in his presence, like she's so flustered and in love or in lust, and he's like just breathe, and she takes his hand right and puts it on her chest. I
was gonna say, isn't this also when she's telling him about like fucking her husband but keeping the photos like on the drawer? Yeah.
And then she is like, oh Tom, but then she like is so like they're so unimportant that like she like confuses the movie stars, and she's like, oh Matt,
and that her husband is completely unfazed by her
unfazed by the whole
names
thing
out.
Yeah. I wanted to point out, because I feel like I've seen not a lot of like films that are actually sexy this year. Like I feel like the sex scenes or the parts that are meant to be like erotic like truly do nothing for me, and I'm like, I don't even believe this. But this film, I was like, wow, like there's so, even though it was like so, it was a lot, like I felt like there were like actually parts, particularly even that scene, I was like, okay, this is kind of hot, like there's tension here, this is hot, I mean, it's also weird but also hot, and I feel like that's rare. I don't know, I was like really into it.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised by how like sexy I found the blowjob scene. I think like part of it is just like the way that it happens, where like Yvonne is sort of like the person who's like initiating, and she's the one who wants to give PJ the blowjob, and she's sort of talking about like how, like her mind wanders and obviously her mouth wanders. No judgment. And like I think like him sort of like being really into it and also like being kind of opportunistic about it, but at the same time just like him finding this like random chatterbox like kind of charming and being like, yeah, I'll take a blowjob. And I think like the other thing is just that like Harvey Keitel, whatever Daniel may say, just like looks really hot in this movie. Like
yes, I agree.
He has like a really like solid torso, and it's just like we talked about this when we were talking about the piano, about like how you have these like bodies that look like human bodies as opposed to like these like Marvel bodies, and the sort of like ability to like recognize like the body on screen as like something like kind of analogous to your own life.
Yeah.
I sort of like forgot how like nicely like erotic that can be.
I don't know if outside of the context of this film, I would feel the same way about Harvey, but definitely within the context of this film, I'm just like, I don't know what spell like Campion put us under, but I was like, yeah.
I think a lot of it is like the same as like in the piano, where there is like both this like hyper masculinity to them, but also this like complete willingness to be vulnerable and to sort of like be subdued almost, that I think really works for him.
And I think that Campion obviously deeply understands the sensuality and intimacy of the female gaze. And that's like that's what we're seeing when we see Harvey in both the piano and in this film, is that like understanding of what makes him sexy, and that's why he is so alluring.
I think that like the whole scene where Ruth is basically like cross-dressing TJ is also supposed to be like the scene of like humiliation and like emasculation. And yet, like, I also found that scene really hot, where she's like holding up this like lipstick like in front of his face, and then just like very slowly like puts the lipstick like on his lips, and then it sort of like undresses him and like puts him in the dress. And I was like, oh, like obviously she's trying to like make him feel bad, and she's trying to like make him feel like less of a man or whatever. But at the same time, like there's something about like that scene where it like seems to like really undo him, because the morning afterward he is like, I'm in love with you, like let's get married. But then also just like the sheer like sensuousness of like dressing someone, it's just, like this like really like fun reversal of like the usual sex scene of like undressing someone. And I just like that whole thing. It's just like a nice sort of like way of like rephrasing something that like we're all like a rephrasing a concept like we're all very familiar with, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't know if I thought it was like I don't think I would have used the word hot, but I was really moved by that scene, and I actually felt like it was really tender and one of the most intimate moments, because similar to the peace, like what we were talking about, the peace scene of her like kind of letting her guard down, I felt like that was a moment for him to be it felt very vulnerable, and I felt like the intensity of that vulnerability in that moment, and I was like really moved. And I think the way that it changed their relationship as well, because, you know, like she was trying to make fun of him, and I don't know how successful that was, because then when he writes "be kind" on her forehead, I don't know, it was just incredibly vulnerable. That whole sequence was so vulnerable to me.
I think like part of her vulnerability comes from, and this goes back to what Daniel was saying about like the analogizing between like what she goes through in India and what he goes through in her presence, is that in the same way that like Ruth wants to be opened up and be transformed from the outside, he like wants to do that like for her, or like wants to open himself up for that experience. And so he like knows in the back of his mind that like she's being mean, but at the same time he's just sort of like open to being this canvas for her.
Yeah, which then it disarms her in turn, because she kind of realizes the extent of her own cruelty, and I was like, wow, that kind of clarity and self-awareness was not like that to me was her real transformation, and like realization, like you were saying earlier, Inkoo, or was it Daniel, about taking control of her life and and kind of seeing herself. You know, that moment was almost like a mirror.
So I think that what at least I perceived as what was happening in this moment of PJ's like utter submission is that it kind of mirrors, as we're talking about all this mirroring, it kind of mirrors what seemed to be his experience with the first guru that actually like sexually like molested him. And this is possibly the kind of like submission that he wanted to experience the first time, that wasn't this like just straight sexual, like, well, not even straight because it's gay obviously, but like this like direct sexual manipulation, and actually just be like have a moment of freeing himself from the masculinity he's been in some ways trapped in himself, even without knowing that that's what he wants to get out of. And so I think that like that's the experience he's having. And so while Ruth may be like thinking she's subjecting him to this cruelty, he doesn't perceive it as such, and so then is able to return to her the be kind on her forehead moment that actually then is what breaks her free from this cruelty, and kind of understand more like the experience that each other are having.
You guys, this movie is so good.
Yeah.
It really is so good. Like, I was not expecting anything of this movie at all. Not in like a bad way or a good way, but I was just like, well, it's another 2-hour Jane Campion movie. Here we go. And I just found it like so much more enjoyable than I could ever have guessed.
Lovia, the last like 2 or 3 movies that we saw were definitely just like a lot less productive in its messiness. And like sometimes, I'm sure you've had this experience where sometimes you watch like a thing that's like messy, but it doesn't have like the interesting elements that like make up for all of the messiness, and you're like, why am I here like working through like this like thing that clearly needs so much more editing or development or both. And it was like one of those things where it, like for me at least, there's a sort of like productive messiness, because like, could it be structured better? Like, sure. But also, do I sort of like the way like it's full of like loose threads and not everything is like hyper telegraphed, so that like I can sort of try to figure out on my own like what's happening in the movie instead of like it telling me what to think. Like, it's just been like a really great movie going experience for me.
Yeah, I really agree. I think that it offered so much, and I think it was just, this is so corny, but it was just really brave, you know? And I like, and maybe this is just because I'm watching again, like I've been watching a series of kind of dud films that don't feel like they're taking any risks, but I liked the fact that not everything worked, because I'm like, at least you tried, you know? And it gave us a lot to talk about, especially. And then I finished the movie and I was like, I have really strong feelings about this that I now need to work through. And that's always so fun, and like feels like, you know, just rare now. I'm really like shitting on contemporary film, sorry.
And I think like risk is like a really good way of like thinking about this movie, because it does take a bunch of risks, and that it gives you like a protagonist with like a very like uncinematic crisis. It like really gives you a type of story that the movies haven't, for whatever reason, like really dove into. And I can totally see like why this movie failed when it first came out, because it's so unconventional. But I think from like 22 years like henceforth, it is like so very obviously like just putting in all of this like effort and passion into a thing that like might not work, but damned if she's gonna try.
Exactly. And that counts for so much. That's why I'm a Campion stan.
Well, that is our discussion of this really underrated gem of a film. Thank you so much, Lovia, our underrated gem.
It was a delight to have you on the show.
Oh my gosh, you guys, first of all, Inkoo, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Just kidding. But no, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. Daniel, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise.
And have me back soon.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely have you back next season.
And we're very jealous that you already got to watch The Power of the Dog.
Very jealous.
So, I think without Lovia, we should do Daniel's least favorite segment, which is ranking all of the movies that we have talked about so far on the season. We've got The Piano, Bright Star, Sweetie, An Angel at My Table, and Holy Smoke. I think I'm going to do The Piano on top. I might actually put Holy Smoke before Bright Star, An Angel at My Table, and then Sweetie. I think I love the fact that like this movie is just like bursting with like ideas and with visuals. And I think, as I talked about a little bit with like Bright Star, as accomplished as that movie is, I just never understand like why we have to watch anyone sort of like slowly die like in a movie. So that's what I'm gonna go with.
I think my ranking is Holy Smoke, The Piano,
Wow,
Bright Star, Angel at My Table, and Sweetie.
Wow.
All right, well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining us and for falling under the sway of this season's cult leader, Jane Campion. If you'd like to shoot us a message, we are at allaboutfilmpod@gmail.com, and we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk In the Cut. I have something I could say here that I certainly will not.
Say it.
This just reminds me of all the fake cum scenes in porn.
Oh.
Oh my god.
Sorry. I apologize. I told you I shouldn't say it, but you told me to.
It's true. He did say he shouldn't say it. I was there.
Yeah. Roll the tape back.